Are there any tips you'd give for students in that environment who might be just starting to feel a little bit persuaded by this evolutionary narrative? What would you say to them?
There's tons of answers out there. There's so many challenges for the evolutionists they have yet to answer. It's almost an afterthought now. The main evidence of evolution, I'm like, those are terrible. Now let me tell you how we're succeeding, and the evolutionists have no answer to, and now they're going to have to do the same things we've done to them. There's just such a massive role reversal. There's been such a revolution scientifically and apologetically.
Hey, and welcome to Zero Compromise, helping you stand for truth in a world that falls for lies. I'm Patricia Engler, joined here at the Creation Museum by Jessica DeFord, aka JJ.
Hello.
We have Rocket Rob Webb with us.
Hey guys.
And we have a great conversation today for if you're a young person and you realize that there are some really persuasive evolutionary messages out there, even if you know God's word is true. Maybe there's Christians around you who believe in evolution. Maybe you're getting bombarded by it in your classes. How can you think through those issues? Stay tuned. Who are we talking to today, JJ?
We're very excited to be talking with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He is a research biologist here at the ministry.
And as always, make sure you guys like, subscribe, and share this episode so we can get this message out to as many people as possible. So with that, Dr. Jeanson, thank you for coming on to the show with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and start off. Talk a little bit more about all the awesome stuff you do at our ministry.
I think it's awesome. That's a kind compliment of yours. Hopefully the audience thinks it's awesome too, but I am a kid in candy shop. I get to do research pretty much every day. Most of what I do is in that theme. Technically, I'll speak every now and then. I do lectures through social media or YouTube. We've had some that have gone viral, which has been exciting. See the interest there. Write books. We can talk about some of those too. Recognize the need that even if you make some great discovery, if no one knows about it, what's the point? So that's sort of the broad scope of what I do day to day, but mostly research, which makes me very happy. And I get to sit in my office all day and be introverted.
When you're not debating people about controversial topics.
That's right.
Some of that too.
Yeah, so with a lot of our first-timers, we like to hear people's testimonies. So have you been a Christian most of your life?
I grew up in the church, heard the gospel from an early age, prayed the sinner's prayer many times for lack of assurance of my salvation. Lived in sin for most of my teen years. So when I was 13, my dad sat down with me in Germany. My mother's German, and I just remember that was the location, and said, okay, if you're not sure of your salvation, here's what 1 John says, which is ironic because then struggled with pornography for most of my teen years, and 1 John says you can be sure you're not saved if you're living in sin. So that was a long-standing, I guess, dilemma for me. I understand what the Word of God says about Jesus' death, resurrection, all that. Why isn't it working, in a sense? Why is it not producing the fruit I'm supposed to be seeing? So I'd say about halfway through graduate school, and this whole time, of course, externally maintaining, I guess in a sense, a facade or even self-deception of being a good person, exemplary student. People would still say that he was such a good kid, and that's not a bragging thing as much as I was great at pretending, in that sense, hiding what I knew to be habitually true. Or telling myself it wasn't a habit because I could stop Friday, or I almost got baptized during that time saying, how am I going to share my testimony? Well, I was sinning, but I stopped Friday. It's laughable in retrospect. I mean, how many of us do that though? When you're enslaved to sin, you make all sorts of excuses. So I'd say it wasn't until graduate school, just sitting with the Bible for a couple weeks maybe, and reading through the book of Hebrews, and where I'd say the gospel went from being old news, because I'd heard it my entire life, could recite it, quote the verses, to being good news, where it was attractive, and hey, the hope of heaven is being with God, and holiness is part of the hope of heaven. And so if that's not attractive, and the Bible speaks of holiness as objectively beautiful, the Bible speaks of certain things as objectively beautiful, a foreign concept, but it's biblical. There are certain things that are subjective, but this is objectively so. And I feel like that's part of being born again, is your eyes are open to see holiness itself is beautiful, it's desirable. If you don't want that, because that's the promise of Christianity, is a holy heaven. And if you don't want a holy heaven, what's the point? Why are you a Christian? So that's where things, I guess, transform me. Maybe I was born again then. I don't know. Going back to the idea of assurance of salvation. Book of Hebrews, I think, teaches you can know you're saved by, in a sense, looking to the future. You get assurance of a past event by looking to the future. Do you continue to the end? And I'm sure you've talked about this on the podcast, and I'm 44 and have seen too many examples, I think, in my lifetime of people you think are on the straight and narrow, and you're like, what in the world? Where do they go? Totally apostate, or they start incorporating heresy. And so I feel like I can see that truth played out in my own lifetime, even though I'm middle-aged, I guess you could say, halfway through my life. And yet I've already seen people I grew up with, or prominent evangelicals I, in a sense, grew up with, Josh Harris being one of them. Kiss Dating Goodbye, that was a book contemporary in my age, growing up, and now he's apostate, essentially. But even personal friends, where we went to Christian school together, or we were at college together. He was a professing believer, and now he's who knows what. So you can be sure you're saved if you continue to the end. You look to the future, and so I'm trusting Jesus every day. To me, is the mantra of a true believer.
Yeah, and it seems like false conversion is really a big problem in the church today. Make sure you guys check out one of our previous episodes we did with Trevor Sheets from Living Waters on the Mount Ministries. Really good conversation about that. Talks a lot about the sinner's prayer, being baptized multiple times, not really having that assurance assurance, and one of the things like you mentioned is it's that holiness. It's really the repentance, the turning from sin. That's what a lot of these people, a lot of the Christians are really missing from having that born again experience. But what's most important is that you're born again now. You have the assurance of everlasting life today. So I always tell people it's good to reflect on the past, but what's most important is that you're saved now.
Absolutely. Where did you go to college, and what was your major in?
I grew up in Wisconsin, so I went to a local state school system, University of Wisconsin Parkside. The alums called it the dark side. I think it was probably the lowest average.
You're from Wisconsin.
Well, not originally, but yes, I've lived in Wisconsin for a very long time, so I claim Wisconsin as where I'm from. Yes. Yeah. Oh, you betcha, don't you know there?
Go Packers.
Sorry. I like to insist we don't have any accents in Wisconsin. Yes, thank you. Thank you. But my wife, who's from Alabama, doesn't agree with me. So I'm slowly admitting the fact that I guess there is a Wisconsin accent, even though I don't like to admit it. So I went to University of Wisconsin Parkside, again, lowest average ACT entrance score, I think. But they had a big biology department, and they had a strong faculty-student ratio. So I got into a lab right after my freshman year, which I'm talking to contemporaries, peers who went to bigger schools, often harder, at Madison or one of the flagship universities because it's just so huge. But that was, I think, a big stepping stone to being able to get into graduate school right away. So I was invited to the program when I applied, or I should say I applied to the program or to the school. They said, hey, we've got this molecular biology and bioinformatics 3+2 program. So that's just basically studying life at the smallest molecular level, atoms, DNA, RNA, protein, that sort of thing. And bioinformatics is simply using the computer to analyze all that because there's reams of data that you can't physically look at with your eye in a lifetime, and you need a computer program to pick out the good stuff. And they said you could get your master's in 5 years, so undergraduate plus master's in 5 years instead of 4 years plus 2 more, 6 years total. Interesting. My dad was a dentist, and he had encouraged me for some time, saying if you want to get a good job in today's environment, today being back then you need an advanced degree. And so the plan was all along to get some sort of advanced degree. Then I learned master's doesn't actually speed up the PhD process any. So I thought, well, if there's some way to skip it, which you can, you just need research experience essentially because graduate schools are a business, and so they want alums who make it through the program, get high-paying jobs, and give to the alumni fund. And so people who drop out are not good candidates. And so, do you know you like research? Have you demonstrated competence in research? All that is what they're looking for. I was able to get that at Wisconsin Parkside. And then I was interested in cancer research at the time and actually read about a quack idea of cancer that I eventually rejected, but that's what motivated me to go. I went to Harvard because they had the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute is affiliated with it. And so I remember talking to one of the professors when I visited the summer before, just to feel out labs and such. And, oh, you want to work on cancer? Great. There's 10,000 people here working on cancer, which quickly becomes overwhelming. How do you pick someone? But eventually found actually a stem cell lab, adult stem cell lab, because that's 2003, 2004 is when I was doing it. That's when the connection between cancer and stem cells was just becoming a hot topic. Now it's kind of taken for granted, I think, and ended up there. And then, anyway, further down the path, ended up in creation science. But that's how I did. That was the schooling background for me.
Awesome.
Cool.
Right.
So you went to essentially a secular school for your undergraduate.
In an Ivy League one.
Ivy League, which is so sad because Harvard was founded by Christians initially, and then over time it was a religion of secular humanism that really took over. But when you're in that college setting, I mean, obviously being a Christian, were you a young earth creationist at the time as well?
Yes, I was homeschooled through 8th grade, and I can pause and give advice, I guess, because many people ask, what would you say to students wanting to go off? And I guess I've been able to look back on my own experience and see what happened, maybe even subconsciously, not accidentally, but I don't know that we're trying to accomplish this, but looking back, I can say, oh, it was good. So I'll go back and forth, I guess, between the advice and then my own experience. Mm-hmm. So the advice I give is there are 2 pieces, I guess. One is don't be afraid to take a year off to be grounded apologetically. So I can look back at my own experience. I grew up in a Christian home, homeschooled with explicit young earth creation curriculum. And going to Ken Ham lectures, last couple of years, I think, found my notes from a Ken Ham lecture about, have you been evolutionized? Was the opening question. I thought, what a good question. Start a lecture with, makes you think. And had that strong worldview training. My parents saw to it, again, even in middle school, going to lectures like this. John Morris talking about sounds of a dinosaur you may have heard in the jungle. It sticks with you. And then my parents picked there were 3 Christian school options in the area. So I was born 1980, and the early 80s was just when the homeschool movement in Wisconsin, at least, was sort of getting its footing. There were still questions about could you get into a college if you had a homeschool diploma from high school. So I went, and so that was part of the concern in going off to Christian high school. My parents picked a young earth one. Not all of them were in the area, Racine, Wisconsin. So I had more training there. I was also reading a lot of the material from the Institute for Creation Research or Answers in Genesis, whatever was available at the time. So much so that I feel like I could bring the argument to the professors once I got off to secular college. And we had a biology 102 professor, super smart, strange guy though, and tried to ask diplomatically pointed questions in class to, at least for the sake of the students listening, make them think. But so the second piece of advice then is I actually learned from Marvin Olasky, was with World Magazine, waffles on the age of the earth issue, but he was a professor of journalism, I think, at UT, University of Texas, Austin, which I lived in Texas for 6 years, and Texas talks about seceding, and Austin talks about seceding from Texas if they were to secede from the United States.
Everything's bigger.
Yes, everything's bigger, and they're like the California of Texas, for context. And so in a very liberal environment is my point, and had seen probably Christians coming through thoroughly secular college in a thoroughly secular city, and his advice to any student coming through was expect to read double. Whatever discipline you're in, doesn't even matter if you're in English, you're going to hear a secular worldview in class. And you have to plan to dedicate just as much time inside class as outside of class reading something else. Reading the Christian perspective on English, on literature, on science, on biology. And for me, I think I can look back and see, well, in a sense I was doing that, so I guess these two pieces of advice kind of go together. You have to be prepared. It's hard to read double in class because you're busy. You take full credit, 16 credit hours, and you're trying to do well. You're occupied. And so I was fortunate. I had scholarships. I didn't have to work. I don't know how students who work do it because you're constantly on the go. How are you going to have time to read double? So to me, there's wisdom in taking a year off, a gap year between high school and college. I mean, I was trying to reinvent the wheel, I realized, when I first came to Answers in Genesis. We've got 6 classes or more now where you can take them during your summers as a high school student. We already have programs in place to help people prepare to read double ahead of time because, again, frankly, how are you going to have time to do it when you're a college student? And if you're not prepared, you'll get bowled over quicker than you can believe. Again, we already talked about this, but so many people who've gone astray. But people in the program with me or in the science field as an undergraduate who now go a different direction. Sad stories. So that's the goal, to prevent that. How do you prevent that? And to me, it's critical to be grounded ahead of time because you're going to have to read double at a minimum. And maybe it's possible. Maybe you can take full credits or maybe take 12 credits and you dedicate time to read on the side. But I feel like on the go by the seat of your pants is risky. And so I can look back and be grateful to my parents for having chosen that, I guess, homeschool through 8th grade and then explicitly Young Earth Christian High School. I commuted. This is maybe one third piece of advice. I commuted for undergraduate, and there was only one summer I had to live on campus because of the summer program I was in, and opened my eyes to the typical dorm life, I guess, which I was grateful then to have be able to avoid, and to use maybe a graduate school example as sort of a dorm life. What are you getting yourself into? And grateful to have avoided it. I remember the first semester as a graduate student at Harvard, they had departmental retreats. And I think I asked the guy who was my host when I first visited Harvard, so what goes on? He's like, debauchery. This is an unbeliever talking to me. That was his term that he used. Wow. I was like, so it must be bad. Yeah. Wow. And that's also a huge pressure. There's academic, intellectual, apologetic pressure you're going to hear in class, but there's also moral, spiritual pressure constantly in the dorm rooms. So if you can commute, I lived at home. It was great. I'm grateful in retrospect. When I went to graduate school, I lived with Christians because there were websites set up for being able to find Christian housemates, roommates. Great. It's probably, I'm an old man now in a sense. So much has changed in the college campus. It's even worse than it was. Just to give one more example, I remember watching God's Not Dead with my dad. He's like, man, they made that guy look bad. I'm like, no, Dad, that's what the professors are like. It is that bad in college. And it's even worse now than what I experienced. So there is a trial by fire when you go. It's foolish to think I'm just going to handle it. Don't be foolish. I said that as an old man, 44, because the pressures are so intense, and just the small tastes I got of what I was able to avoid. I'm grateful to have avoided it thanks to my parents and just God's providence.
Just going to say you look good for the 44-year-old.
But yeah, that's super solid advice. I can definitely resonate being a Christian in those secular classes. And even though I had a solid basis in apologetics, for which I was so thankful, because I don't know how I would have managed otherwise. But even still, because you're hearing it all the time, it's just kind of like a brainwashing thing. And thankfully, I had like a few little tips, like, okay, every time I hear something presented as evidence for evolution, I can ask, okay, is there actually new genetic information happening here? No. So is there any kind of tips like that you would give young people? I mean, you've written an entire book on why evolution, as Darwin explained it, isn't true. But are there any tips you'd give for students in that environment who might be just starting to feel a little bit persuaded by this evolutionary narrative? What would you say to them?
That's a good question. And I think several things come to mind. One is, I guess, just as a broad, general brushstroke, there's tons of answers out there. I think I'm supposed to have a meeting with a guy who's got lots of questions for me because he's read a lot of the atheist blogs. I'm like, your questions show you haven't read anything we've written because we've answered almost all that. And that's not a boast. That's an objective reality that there's so many things out there, so many of them often for free, I mean, we could talk about the books, but we have so many articles on the website that cover much of the same material that, in a sense, and I don't mean this in a harsh way, there almost is no excuse where, well, yeah, we're trying to hide this aspect of creation science because we just don't have good answers. No, I think we have good answers for almost, I could speak as a biologist, everything in biology. There isn't really anything good that's out there. I'm saying that in 2024, having done a lot of research and made a lot of progress, but I can say it even going back to my undergraduate experience, 1999 to 2003, sitting through organismal biology class, which is essentially an Introduction to Evolution Biology 102. And there was nothing, I don't feel like there was anything I heard that was new from what I had heard reading the creationist materials, because the answers were there. I could offer challenges. There's so many challenges for the evolutionists they have yet to answer. They try to avoid. So the way has been paved for any student, in a sense, to be successful. That doesn't mean it's going to be fair. Again, I feel like there's so many unfair things happening in college where discrimination and deliberate attempts to suppress the truth, which is what Romans 1 says, that it's not a guarantee. I don't mean to set up false hope that there's a guarantee of success academically, but in terms of surviving apologetically, there's so many answers out there for the taking. And maybe I should say, talking about reading double, there's so much more double to be read than people realize. So don't underestimate how much time it'll take. It's not. So the reason there's a whole book on this, Replacing Darwin, is because there just are that many answers out there. And so I wrote that, in a sense, for myself when I was an undergraduate, to be able to hand to my unbelieving classmate to say, you need to read this. But it's for believers too, because it covers pretty much all the evidences you'll hear in class, the evidences you'll read about in the textbooks. Plus, and this is the exciting part, we've made so much more progress. We're no longer in a defensive posture. Again, thinking about this conversation I'm going to have later this week with a guy who's got a bunch of questions, I'm like, you know what? Let's not even talk about the questions. First, read this. There's so many things we can now push back against the evolutionists on. It's almost an afterthought now. The main evidences of evolution, I'm like, those are terrible. Now let me tell you how we're succeeding, and the evolutionists have no answer to, and now they're going to have to do the same things we've done to them. There's just such a massive role reversal. There's been such a revolution scientifically and apologetically that go read. I said that in a very positive, excited exhortation sense, because I think you'll be blown away by how much is out there and will be so much more equipped to deal with what you're going to hear in class.
I think there is some people who hear the word creationist and immediately shut it down and shut down any science that a creationist is doing because they don't think you're credible because you're a creationist. Did you experience that even as somebody who graduated from Harvard, an Ivy League school, that still people will shut it down and say, well, you're a creationist, it doesn't matter.
Anti-science and all this other stuff.
Yes. So I think I was fortunate in the degree I did to avoid a lot of confrontation. And I guess just to put a plug in here, one of the most exciting feedback I've gotten from Replacing Darwin, some of the zookeepers here have said, hey, it really helped me through biology class. I'm like, good, that's the whole point of why this book was written. I don't know how zoology majors do it, because what you have to work on day in and day out is the evolution classification of life. Molecular biology, what I was doing, we had that intro to evolution class, but then most of my coursework was basic genetics, basic molecular biology, and some of that origin stuff gets worked in. But there's a whole lot of day-to-day science we're just trying to understand. Or maybe give a more extreme example. Let's say you're a paleontology or a geology student. Again, I don't know how they do it, because you have to deal with millions of years, day in and day out. That's just the subject matter. Graduate school, I'm working on, again, cancer questions, on stem cell questions. Those are how do things work right now? And people will throw in, because we're working on the immune system, blood stem cells. Oh, this part of the immune system is conserved through evolution. They'll throw in evolutionary terminology, but it was very rare, I feel like. And again, I didn't have the same level of day in and day out pressure that a geology student, a paleontology student, a zoology student will have. So I feel like I personally was able to escape a lot of that. I think we invited, now I remember the story, we invited an Institute for Creation Research speaker to my church at one point. I wanted to hang up flyers at my undergraduate institution, and I think they allowed it, which I'm kind of shocked even now to think back that they would permit that. And the faculty were probably not happy. I feel like I had good relationships with the faculty and they knew I was a creationist, but they weren't so obnoxious or hostile, which again, it varies from school to school. And my sort of loose observation is, and in Harvard, I feel like I got very little. I think on my application form, I said, when they asked, do you want to meet with any minority groups or something, I said like conservative Christian, just to see if they'd push back. And if they said they're not a minority group, I'd say, well, produce one, Yeah. See if you can find one. So there, I don't feel like they were trying to be at the forefront of the battle. And I wonder how much of this comes down to money. Harvard is this gigantic endowment. They don't need to establish their bona fides. They don't need to worry about money. They don't need to kind of flex their muscles and say, we're definitely not the creationists. And I wonder how many small schools you actually get more pressure because their grant money is less. And so if there's even a whiff of sympathy towards creation science, money's gone. Now what's the school going to do? So I have this loose working model that it may be more difficult at times to go through small schools because they kind of they don't have a chip on their shoulder, but they have more to prove. Whereas Harvard's like, we're Harvard, who cares? I mean, I don't know that I would still be listed on their website, but what's it going to do to their reputation, really? But some small school, oh, you're the creationist school, and that's going to ding them for a while to come. So for me, I feel like I was able to raise my hand diplomatically in class when I wanted to, put down on the test, here's the answer you're looking for. I don't agree with it, which I didn't like. But what can I say? They can't mark it wrong. I give the right answer. I don't even know that I spoke up much in class because I didn't have that much classwork in my PhD program. And my lab mates, that's my peers basically for most of my time there, knew where I stood, and we had friendly conversations. I actually had really good relationships with them. I mean, I'd go out to the bar with them. I'd be like, well, I don't drink. That's just my personal conviction. They're like, oh, okay. I'm like, sometimes I get more pushback from Christians for saying I don't drink than from these unbelievers who thought, oh, great, do what's good for you.
Yeah.
Sort of almost the tolerant attitude. I remember one time, too, they were having some discussion about some Christian topic, maybe. Maybe it was Christmas. They're like, Jeanson, come here. We're all pagans, so we don't know the answer to this. So can you tell us about Christmas or Easter?
Wow.
Whatever it was.
Okay. Interesting.
So it was it's Northeast Boston's a very hostile, oppressive environment for believers because it's so left-wing. I went to one more story. I'll stop monologuing. But interesting one, I think. Because it was stem cells, of course, there's other Bible science issues that deal with the pro-life issue and embryonic stem cells and these sorts of things. So long story short, I was invited to be a panelist at the Massachusetts pro-life conference while I was in Boston, along with another guy who was, he was a professor at MIT or one of the schools there and was friendly to the pro-life cause. So to talk about stem cells. But while I was there, I got to hear other people speak, including one of the members of the Massachusetts legislature. And he said that the Massachusetts legislature is so toxic to anything conservative that his colleagues on the other side of the aisle would ask what the Christians were for and then do the opposite as their method of determining what to legislate next. Wow. So despite all that, I was able to survive, again, I think because of, thanks to my parents, the upbringing, being prepared, also what I chose as a career, where it wasn't day in and day out, constant evolution, though I feel like I would have been prepared there too. But, how do you graduate a thesis with being a creationist? So that's still an ongoing challenge. That's not to minimize any of that, but I feel like there's ways to be prepared, because there's so many answers out there in print, on the internet, to survive in an environment even as hostile as the Northeast.
And on that note, make sure you guys check out Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson's Replacing Darwin. He has one for super smart people and one for simple people like me. So make sure you guys get both of those copies. They're available on our website, answersingenesis.org. He also has another book called Trace, if you guys want to check that out as well. It sounds like that's kind of like the follow-on to those first two books. So really good stuff. And so make sure you guys also come back next week. We're going to have Dr. Jeanson on for part 2. We're going to continue our conversation, so you won't want to miss it.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining. We hope you tune in next time. And meanwhile, please keep standing on the truth of God's word with zero compromise.
See you guys later.
God bless.